His eyes fell on the top story of the house at the edge of the quarry. The casement window flew open like a light flashing on. A human figure, faint and insubstantial at that distance and height, forced itself far out and stretched its arms out even further. Who was it? A friend? A good man? One who sympathized, one who wanted to help? Was it one person? Was it everybody? Was there still help? Were there objections which had been forgotten? Certainly there were. Logic is, of course, unshakable, but it cannot hold out against a man who wants to live. Where was the judge he had never seen? Where was the high court he had never reached? He raised his hands and spread his fingers wide. This is the second to last paragraph of Der Prozess, or The Trial, a book written by Franz Kafka. It tells the story of a man called Joseph K., who is convicted one day and put on trial because of a crime he allegedly committed. Throughout the book, K's only purpose is to find out what that crime is that he's thought guilty of having committed, and to prove his innocence in order to avoid punishment. Kay sees himself in the necessity to come in contact with the many faces of an obscure and very complicated system from which he never really gets an answer to the question of what he did wrong. Despite of all his efforts, right after what I just read in the end of the book, Kay is executed in that quarry by two men of the government dressed in black for a wrongdoing that he never really knew of, and without having been able to prove his innocence. I read this book when I was about 14 years old. I had my mother buy it for me, actually. I was curious to read something by Kafka, even though I didn't really know who he was or what he wrote about. My mother, on the other hand, well, she was mainly the one who passed on me the habit of reading. She had read Kafka, and she had read this book. And so when I told her that I wanted to read it, she said that perhaps it would be better if I read it later, when I was a bit more mentally mature and prepared to deal with such a thing. However, as any 14-year-old receiving advice from his parents, I decided to do the exact opposite thing, and I read the book, and as a result of which, I experienced true anxiety and uneasiness for weeks. This was the first book that made me see the sheer power that a story can have on a person. It was this book, together with many of the others that I read during that period of my life, that brought me to the decision to study literature. And to my surprise, that wasn't a very popular choice amongst the people in my social circle back then. However, I was convinced that it was the right choice for me, mainly because during my encounter with Kafka and with the other authors that I had read by then, I had developed a very intense passion for the art of storytelling and for stories in general. I wanted to know how it was that a story could cause somebody anguish like it did to me, or any other strong emotion. It was out of this interest and fascination for stories that I made two assumptions that justified my decision to study literature. I like stories, and the best place to find stories is, of course, in literature. And following that, only by studying literature will I be able to learn how to approach them critically, how to analyze them correctly and put them apart into little pieces, like a mechanic would do to a car engine. Today, I would like to talk to you about these two assumptions, why both of them are wrong, and why I believe it is nevertheless important to think about the relevance of stories through these assumptions. So first of all, to think that the best place to find stories is in literature is not completely wrong, I would say. The history of literature is that of the great stories that have moved and captivated generations and societies through time. So yes, stories are definitely to be found in literature, but it would be very naive and dangerous to think, like I did, that their presence and their influence is limited to books. There are some very obvious examples of stories outside literature that probably everybody here can relate to. Think about the story of how your parents met, or the story of your last breakup, or the stories that you tell your friends when you're catching up after a long time of not having seen each other. The telling of all of these everyday anecdotes is, at its core, not that different from Kafka's book. Both share the same basic features that make up a story. They have a narrative instance, which means that they are told to us by somebody, by some kind of narrator or some entity. They have a setting, which means that they take place in a certain space and time, either fictional or real. They have characters or actors who experience change through the passage of time or through their own actions. And those actions and those happenings are the ones that make up the plot of the story, both in Kafka's book as well as in many of the anecdotes that you tell to your friends. These everyday stories that we get in contact with through the people close to us are just as an example of the relevance of stories outside literature. They are a small proof of how wrong I was with my first assumption when I started studying. The truth is that we are exposed to stories every single day, not only through literature and not only through the people that we know. Stories are also in our media, they are in our politics, they are in our societies. Sometimes they are even rooted already deep within us without us having noticed. The reason why I find it so important to talk about this is because not all of the stories that we come in contact with are as innocent as the anecdotes that you tell your friends or as harmless as a story in a novel. There is already one great TED Talk on this topic by the Nigerian writer Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, where she talks about the dangers of the stories that we are told, especially taking into consideration how vulnerable and impressionable we are in the face of a story. The examples that Adichie mentions in her talk belong to the group that I would describe as the stories that go beyond the purpose of entertaining us and informing us. The stories that are made to shape our perception of reality and change the way we look at our surroundings. The stories that are normally told by people or groups of people who are in power and who want to have their actions or their views towards certain things justified. Like the story that an innocent man is actually all of a sudden guilty of having committed a terrible but mysterious crime, and that he has to be punished by death because of what he did. Or coming to reality, the ridiculous story that people of a certain religion do not belong in this country. Or that the story that Mexican migrants like myself are actually mostly rapists and criminals who are to be compared with animals and haven't got much to offer. These are also the stories that we come in contact with every single day, regardless of whether you like to read Kafka or not. There are many things that make these stories so dangerous and so poisonous. First of all, they like to be told in disguise, as if they were something else, something more than stories, as if they were the objective description of a situation, or an unquestionable truth, or even scientific evidence, or a law in a constitution. And second of all, these stories tend to appeal and relate to entire groups of people, of real people. And in doing so, these collective narratives become particularly dangerous because they simplify our reality by putting things into extremes. The characters of those stories tend to be either friends or foes, and the plot tends to be us against the others. So after this, at least it should become clear that I was very simple-minded in doing my first assumption when I started studying. Literature is not the best or the only place to find stories. In fact, they are everywhere. We see our worlds through them, and we all have a very natural need to tell stories and to have stories told to us. And so taking this into consideration, I would like to come now to finish to my second assumption, which I think not only is, but should be wrong. When I started studying literature, or when I made the decision to study literature, more than once I was confronted by either grown-ups or people my age who gave me skeptical looks and asked me questions like, what do you plan to do with your life after having studied literature? Or what is the point of studying literature and the humanities in the 21st century? The question that was probably the hardest for me to answer back then was, why would you want to devote time to study literature at a university if you can grab a book and read it and understand it and think about it without having a degree from a university that certifies that you know how to do that? I think that is a very valid point up to a certain extent. I wouldn't say that I haven't done anything of importance in the last 3 years of studying literature, or that everything that I have learned I could have learned by myself. However, for the particular purpose of looking at stories and at the way we interact with them every single day, I think that this argument that was made to me back then becomes a lot more relevant. The truth is that you don't have to have studied literature in order to be critical or analytical about stories. That is wrong. You don't even have to be particularly smart. So if this is something that we are all able to do, then we all have the same responsibility to actually do it. If stories are not only to be found in literature but everywhere, if we are exposed to them, if we explain ourselves, our world through stories, then why would it be reasonable that only the people who study literature should be the ones who are critical about them? Why should everyone else read and hear these stories without trying to question what they tell, how they tell it, or why they are telling it? And let me be clear, this doesn't mean that I believe that right now only the people who study literature are the ones who are critical about stories. But I do believe that at the bottom of this, there is a standard that we need to escape from, a generalized conception that the humanities, and therefore literature, have little use in the 21st century, in the digital era, that they are pointless or obsolete. And I think it is actually the other way around. I think literature, narrative analysis, for instance, is of particular importance today, when many of the stories that we face, just like the story of Joseph K.'s trial, can cause a person anguish and pain, and are in many cases just as fictional, which means that they are just not true. The next time that you see a speech, any possible speech by the current president of the United States of America, or the next time that you read an article about the catastrophic situation in a developing country, or that you think about what you already know about countries in the African continent or in a certain region like the Middle East, or when you hear about what happened in Gaza last week, try looking at all of those things like what many of them are, stories. Be able to recognize them from facts and from scientific evidence. Look at the characters that they are presenting. See who is being presented as the hero and who is being presented as the villain. Look at the narrative instance and ask yourself what its motivations could be for telling this story in particular. Be aware of the story as a whole and not just a bit of it, and of other stories that relate to the same thing in order to get a wider perspective. All of those little things are just simple ways in which we can all fulfill our shared responsibility in this world of ours that is mostly made out of stories. I don't know if you remember what I read at the beginning from Kafka's book. Right before Joseph K. is executed, right before a story justifies his death, K sees the figure by the window in the house at the edge of the quarry, and he gets a glimpse of hope. He asks himself if that person, who could also be everybody, knows an objection which had been forgotten and that could save him. He raises his hands and stretches his fingers right before the end. I think that we should make all the best of our efforts to make sure that this wonderful thinking tool that we all possess, that we can use to tell the most beautiful tales and to see our reality, that it can no longer be used so easily for wrong. That we know for certain that no single story can justify the pain or the suffering of a person. And that if we ever get to be the person by the window in the house at the edge of the quarry, that we're actually able to help. Thank you very much.